Well, there are a few people still registering out front, but a curious hush seems to have fallen over the room, which makes me think that we should get started. My name is Tom Donnelly. I'm the head of the Center for Defense Studies here at AAI. I'm very pleased to see such a distinguished crowd, soberly dressed, much higher class crowd than we often get at this time of the morning. So welcome. I'm also especially pleased to have Mr. Smith with us today. People in Washington lament the loss of bipartisanship, but it's worth remembering that acts of bipartisanship begin with somebody getting out of their comfort zone and coming to talk to people with whom they normally disagree. I don't suggest that this is, he's not actually coming to the Death Star this morning here at AEI, but we are very pleased to have Mr. Smith come talk to us. He's a very serious and sober member of Congress. He's in his 8th term. He served almost all, I believe, if not all of his previous years as a member of Armed Service Committee. In the last Congress, he was the ranking member of the Airland Subcommittee under Mr. Skelton. And he's devoted much of his career to studying and caring about military issues, particularly those associated with the needs for personnel and military families. He's also been, in recent months, a very sober and important voice in describing the facts of the case when it comes to the effects on the Defense Department of the Budget Control Act and the potential effects of the Defense Department in the Super Committee deliberations. Just let me read a few of his quotes that I think really are on the mark with great precision. Mr. Smith urged the Joint Committee to avoid cuts to national defense accounts beyond the reductions already included in the Budget Control Act. And since those have climbed to nearly $500 billion, I think that's, and because both the Secretary of Defense and the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have testified that further cuts would make it impossible for U.S. forces to continue to execute the national security strategy and the national military strategy. That's an important focal point and jumping off point for our conversations. He also said that he's rightly concerned about the effects of sequestration, and just listening to the body language and the rhetoric from yesterday's Super Committee meetings, it seems rather too likely or something that we should worry about, that sequestration may be a more possible than less possible outcome. But Mr. Smith has reminded us that those across-the-board cuts which would occur under sequestration could do serious damage to our national security. So it's very much a pleasure. I know we're going to hear a different point of view than he's had to listen to me. I've testified a couple of times in front of him on the committee, so it's only fair that we return the favor and welcome him to AEI. Mr. Smith, please join us. One program note before we start. I'm going to let Mr. Smith essentially run this meeting. After he makes his remarks, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. We will record that for purposes of the transcript. And because we have a not too large a crowd, we may be able to get through a goodly number of questions in the hour that we have. But please, when the time comes, wait for the microphone, put your statement in the form of a question, and identify yourself so we can prepare an accurate transcript. So the microphone is yours, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate your remarks about the need to have dialogue, not just with people who agree with you on everything. It actually helps develop ideas when you meet and discuss things with people who don't agree with you, and I think that's one of the many challenges as we've become a more partisan and more divided town. But it's not just this town, it's nationwide. I think too often, what the information age has given us is the ability to sort of carve out our own little universe where we only watch the news that agrees with us, we only follow the websites that agree with us. Now certainly there's the potential to use that more broadly to hear differing viewpoints, but I think too often we don't do that. And I remember I was at the Democratic Convention in 2008 And my wife and I were walking around Denver where the Democrats had pretty much taken over. And for one brief moment there, it was like, wow, this is kind of cool because they all kind of agree with us. There's no one come up to me in the grocery store and yelling at me, or about this issue or whatever. There was a moment where I understand why people would like that, but I've been at this long enough to know that doesn't work over the long term. Every couple days, every 4 years maybe, but in general, if you're going to learn and if you're going to be a good representative, you have to listen to everybody. And just, story on the opposite side of that, shortly after I was first elected in 1996, I was out knocking on doors, something that my staff and I do. I wasn't even up for re-election. We just like to sort of go out and find the voters wherever they are. And I knocked on the door, and the woman answered the door and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, I voted for Andy Tate." And I said, "That's cool. I represent everybody in my district, not just the ones who voted for me. So what's on your mind? How can we work together?" And I think if you take that approach, you get to a better place. Certainly the country works more closely together, but also you find the right answers, because without question, if you're simply hanging out in an echo chamber, you're not going to find the weaknesses in your arguments, and you're not going to find the right answers. So that's a long-winded way of saying thank you for having me. It's great to be here at AEI. And these are certainly very, very challenging times for the defense budget and for national security. The pressure being put on us by both the budget, certainly, but also very real national security needs. We still have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. We still have 45,000 troops in Iraq. We still face the threat from terrorists. We face Iran and North Korea, who are growing in both capability and belligerence. China is certainly growing in military capability. It's a very, very dangerous threat environment out there at the time when we are facing a very, very difficult budget situation. So the question is, how do we counter that? How do we protect our defense budget? How do we make sure that there are enough resources to meet the national security challenges that we all know we have? And here I want to start by applauding Chairman Buck McKeon, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, for really focusing on this issue. We've had a series of hearings over the course of the last couple of months that have focused on precisely this question. We've had former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we've had former chairman of the committees, we've had think tank experts come in and talk about it to try to make people broadly aware of it. And I think certainly that is one very, very important issue. I also want to say, by the way, that Buck is doing a great job of maintaining the bipartisan tradition of the committee. We like to say that we are the most bipartisan committee in Congress. While we understand that these days that's a very, very low bar to jump over, it's nonetheless true. We work very closely together on a number of different issues. And I think the numbers that Buck has presented, and I understand he presented them here to you as well, are very helpful. We have to understand that if you cut the budget, this is what it means in terms of how many ships we're going to have, how many planes we're going to have, how many troops we're going to have, and the historical balance to sort of look at as a percentage of GDP, the size of the force at different times in the history, I think is an incredibly important argument. We also had a hearing yesterday where we brought in some economists to talk about the impact on the industrial base and the impact on our economy of job cuts. I also think that is an argument that has not been made as strongly as it should be. And again, I strongly support Mr. McKeon raising those issues because the industrial base argument is critically important. Certainly there's the straightforward jobs issue. I will say just for the moment that I did enjoy having a hearing where the Republicans were arguing that government cutting spending was bad for the economy. Granted, it was a niche area and they made other arguments there, but nonetheless, it was interesting to see. So you've got that, but beyond that, you've also got what the military-industrial base does for our country. And I've gone all around the country visiting our manufacturers, many of whom are represented here, and the manufacturing technology and the workforce that is developed while we're making this equipment is incredibly important for at least two reasons. One, we have to have it if we're going to be able to build what we need to build for national security needs. You cannot say, for instance, we're going to stop building submarines for a few years. We're just going to have a pause and then come back 3 years later and expect the workforce to be there. For those of you who are familiar with the satellite industry, you know that as we slowed down there and faced competition, when you come back a couple years later, the workers are gone, and you can't just, bring them back up. There is a skill set that is necessary to maintain, first of all, for our national security interests, to make sure that we can build the equipment that we need to protect this country, but second of all, for the broader economy. And my district is a great example of this. the Kent Valley has a whole lot of manufacturing in it. And I've visited, gosh, hundreds of different businesses there over the course of the last 15 years. And invariably, when I visit them, and some of them are subcontractors for Boeing and subcontractors for defense industries, but some of them are simply manufacturers of products that go to the private sector as well. But almost all of them started as Boeing engineers. There was a Boeing engineer who was working there who had an idea, tinkered around with it for a while, then went off and started a company. And that grows our economy. The engineers, the innovation, the skill that comes out of the manufacturing we do for the defense industry plays an enormously positive role in the economy at large. And if we make these severe cuts, we will be undermining it. So I think all of those arguments are important. The one thing I would say is I do believe that when we're looking at the charts of how we cut the defense budget, we need to tie that back more directly to specific national security threats. On a certain level, it doesn't really mean anything to your average voter to say, well, we're supposed to have 313 ships. We only have 289. If we make these cuts, we'll go all the way down to 230. Okay, but what are they doing? What does that mean? How does that tie into what our national security needs are? And we had this discussion when Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey came and testified before us, and I thought the general had a great point on this when I asked him, okay, what does it mean for these cuts? And he talked about the #1 biggest threat, I believe, that we face, and that's al-Qaeda and their affiliates and their efforts to generate terrorist attacks against this country. And he talked about how in order to keep track of that network, as the cliche goes, it takes a network to beat a network, we have to have the intelligence. We have to have the support troops. We have to have all of this stuff globally to be tracking what this network is up to. And then the killing of Osama bin Laden is a great example. I had more than a few people come up to me and say, see, this proves that we don't need to be in Afghanistan. All we need is a counterterrorism force. We got bin Laden. It's like, yeah, but here's what was required to get to that point. As fond as I am of the Navy SEALs, they're an incredibly capable group, and I loved the time when I was the chairman of the terrorism subcommittee and got to work directly with SOCOM. There's no more capable group of people that I've ever met in my life. It wasn't just them, and they would be the first ones to tell you that it wasn't just a couple of Navy SEAL teams, going out there to do it. It took the intelligence to develop and find Osama bin Laden, and it also took the presence in Afghanistan to give us a safe place to go from. The helicopters took off from Jalalabad. If we don't have a sympathetic government in Afghanistan, they're not taking off from Jalalabad. So all of that ties in to our national security needs. And then when you look at our concerns in dealing with China and Iran and North Korea, a lot of people ask, why do we have all these troops stationed all over the world? Why do we have aircraft carrier battle groups all over the world and troops everywhere? You have to, again, tie it back to the specific needs. North Korea, as I mentioned, is both capable and belligerent. If we weren't there with the presence that we had, they might feel that they could get away with taking on South Korea. Our presence discourages that behavior, and that presence costs money. In addition, broadly speaking, in Asia, I came across the statistic that last year the United States Navy did 700 separate port calls in different Asian countries. And what that does is it builds relationships, it builds partnerships, all as part of a broad effort to make sure that those sea lanes in that critically important part of the world stays open to all, that China does not sort of flex its newfound muscle in a way that jeopardizes the interests not just of the United States, but of a broad range of countries. We build that relationship by being present. The Secretary of Defense is over in that part of the world right now, and if you've read the press clippings, he is very, very focused on letting people in Asia know we're not going anywhere. We are going to be here, we're going to be a presence, and we're going to be active, because there is considerable doubt about that. And when you're a Vietnam or even a Japan or an India, and you're looking at China saying, how are we going to deal with these guys? If you know that the U.S. is going to be there to be a counterbalance, then that's one set of balancing factors that you look at. But if you think we're not going to be there, if you think the U.S. isn't going to be there as a counterbalance, it leads to a different set of conclusions by what should be very close allies in Asia. And again, all of that costs money. If we have 50 or 60 fewer ships, we're not doing 700 port calls. We don't have as many aircraft carrier battle groups, and we're not able to project power and protect our interests in that way. So I think there's a very powerful argument to be made just on the numbers. if you simply look at the defense budget and say, gosh, if we cut this amount of money out of it, this is where we would be. And by the way, I want to point out, a lot of folks are focused on the sequestration threat. And that's a very legitimate threat. I'm concerned about it. As I love to point out, that's a big part of the reason why I didn't vote for the debt ceiling agreement. But it's not just that. I hate to say this, but all the sequestration does, it's $1.2 trillion. So let's say that the supercommittee defies the odds and is able to cobble together something that plausibly looks like $1.2 trillion, and the budget game enables you to play all kinds of games with those numbers. Even then, most of the experts are saying that doesn't even begin to deal with the larger budget deficit issue, which brings me to my big point here. I do not think that simply arguing about the defense budget and saying, look at the defense budget, if you cut this, here's what's going to happen, here's all the terrible stuff that's going to happen. I do not think that simply arguing in that space is sufficient to win the day. And the reason I don't think that is because our budget debt and deficit are brutal, and we have to deal with them, which is where I need to pull up my charts here. Mike, that's your cue. There we go. That's why I have such an outstanding staff. They take care of me. So, and a lot of people say that the budget deficit is incredibly complicated. And I guess when you get down below a certain level, it may be. But on the surface, it is not complicated at all. It could not be more simple. It is a basic math problem. And what I have here is the 2010 budget data. And basically it shows that we are running a deficit slightly more than 1/3 of what we spend. And that's a big number. So if you're going to imagine that we balance the budget in 2010, taking that just 1 year, you would have to cut 33% out of the entire budget, everywhere. And then my second chart, this is where we spend the money. Now, one of the things I like to say is that the American voters love to cut spending in the abstract. The idea that the government should spend less money they're very fond of, but once you start talking about the specifics, it gets to be a different conversation. And unfortunately, in my job, we don't get to cut spending in the abstract. It's spent somewhere, you have to cut programs. And that sort of shows you where we spend the money. Roughly speaking, 55% of it is so-called mandatory programs, and 38% of it is so-called discretionary programs. I'll explain the so-called sarcasm in a second. And then, of course, you've got interest. So even if the supercommittee gets its $1.2 trillion over 10 years, I mean, that's 110, 120 billion, well, it's $120 billion, as a matter of fact, for 1 year, that didn't even really begin to address the problem. I mean, long term, we've got a deficit that goes beyond what the supercommittee is charged with. And if we're going to get our GDP to debt ratio anywhere close to what the experts think it should be, it's on a pace to go to 80%. If the supercommittee does what it's supposed to do, it really only pulls it down to about 75. We're supposed to be at 50. My point is, more is going to have to be cut, or more revenue is going to have to be brought in. Now, there are many who argue on the Armed Services Committee that we shouldn't be talking about this, that our focus is defense. Don't talk to me about revenue. Don't talk to me about entitlements. That's somebody else's problem. We have to make the case that the defense budget should not be cut. What I'm telling you is if we don't make a case for how to, you can go back a chart actually, if we don't make the case for how to fix that, defense is going to be crucified, because it is part of the discretionary budget. If we don't step up and confront the problem with either revenue or spending outside of the defense budget, give the supercommittee somewhere to go, give people who want to control the deficit, including, by the way, our bond raters, somewhere to go, inevitably defense is going to be crushed. And right now, there is a huge lack of public support for cutting mandatory programs or raising revenue. The support just isn't there. We have got to build some support for that, or we are out of luck, because that's the discretionary portion of the budget. And here's the only real difference between discretionary and mandatory spending and revenue, and this is our bad luck. In order to cut mandatory spending or increase revenue, Congress has to act. Basically, we have to pass a law. In order to cut discretionary spending, Congress simply doesn't act. And you can take a look at how Congress is functioning right now and very quickly conclude that you would much rather be on the side of Congress not acting than having to have them to act to protect what you're interested in. And if we don't do this, this is what happened with the debt ceiling agreement. Couldn't get an agreement on revenue, couldn't get an agreement on mandatory spending, so we just whacked the discretionary, because the discretionary wasn't going to happen at all if we didn't pass a bill. So if we don't step up to that larger problem, we're going to inevitably face huge cuts in the defense budget. Now, I will also point out, I care about more things than just the defense budget. If you can go back to the other chart there. Discretionary spending is also infrastructure. It's also education. It's innovation. I also care about Medicare and Social Security. The poverty rate for senior citizens was 55% before those two programs got put in place. It's now 9%. I think that's a good thing. These are all programs that are going to be worth protecting, which is why I will say if we don't argue specifically for more revenue, and you can do it in a tax reform, lower the rates, broaden the base, and I'm wide open to how we do it. But if we continue to insist that there can be no new revenue, then you should stop arguing about not cutting the defense budget too much. Because if there's no new revenue, the defense budget is going to be cut. So we have got to put that on the table. Now, it's possible, if you have a different view of this other spending and you want to say, look, we're not putting revenue, we want to get it all out of here. Well, I disagree with that, but you can at least make a plausible argument and say, here's what we should cut from these other programs. But we're not hearing that either. So if you want to choose the other option and say don't raise revenue, then get out there and start explaining why you want to cut entitlements by 1/3, by the way. Yeah, you can cut them by a lot less than that and deal with the super committee number. But if you want to deal with getting our debt to GDP ratio down close to 50, and you don't want revenue, and you don't want to touch defense, and you got to cut 33% or 25% at least out of that pie, you are not just doing a little tinkering around with Social Security and Medicare, you are cutting the programs severely. So I honestly believe that we can't ignore this. Now, I've done this little thing for my staff, so I'll do it here too. You can do the, sort of stick your fingers in your ears and go, no, don't talk to me about that. I only care about defense. Here's why defense matters. And I understand that because that's an easier argument to make. You can stand up and say, here's why defense is important. That's a heck of a lot easier than going to an American public that somewhere between 2/3 and 80% opposes raising taxes and cutting entitlements. But if you don't confront that larger, more difficult argument, the snowball is rolling downhill right over the top of you. So we have got to talk about this, in my opinion. The second thing that we have to do is admit that savings can be found within the defense budget in a way that does not jeopardize national security. Basically, embrace the idea of the strategic review that the White House and the Department of Defense are undergoing right now. A lot has changed in terms of what our needs are in the defense budget, and I think we can also agree that in the last decade in particular, a fair amount of money has been wasted on programs that didn't go anywhere or wound up costing vastly more money than we expected to. How can we rethink about the threat environment? How can we be present in Asia or the Middle East or in other key areas in a more affordable way? What type of force are we really going to need? Because keep in mind, our force is still very largely built on the notion of the Cold War. There is a lot of after effect, a lot of programs that are still there. The idea that we have to go toe-to-toe with a peer competitor, the Soviet Union, and be able to defeat them. And we still have a lot of that thinking infecting our thoughts about what programs we need, what size the force needs to be, when in fact the greatest threats that we face right now are asymmetric. They're from Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups. Where would you better spend your money to confront that threat? We are not actually in a Cold War with China. We can have that debate during the Q&A if we want to. They are vastly different than the Soviet Union. We don't have to build a force that imagines a toe-to-toe war with China. We do have to build a force that enables us to continue to be present in Asia and to discourage China from bad behavior, but that force is probably going to look different from one that had to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. How can we do better in terms of how we look at that? And yes, we also have to look at all the money we spend on personnel costs within the military. It is incredibly important to maintain those personnel costs. Our all-volunteer force is critical, and trust me, many of you have served in the military. There are a lot of reasons why people are in the military, but if you have families in particular, you do the calculation. What are the benefits? How does this work? Is it going to enable me to stay in the military? So that's important, but it's also a lot of money. We have to look at it and be thoughtful about how we're going to address that. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but we need a major strategic review that admits that we could possibly spend less money and still have a stronger national security. And there's a great quote which came out of it's a CNAS study. I shouldn't mention other think tanks when I'm president one, and it was basically making the point that during the course of the Cold War, we had a very clear idea of what equipment we wanted to build. You could look at what the Soviet Union had, and you could say, how do we counter it? And that was sort of our focus. Well, since the end of the Cold War, we've sort of bounced around a little bit trying to figure out exactly what our force structure should be, and I think this couple of quotes here sort of best summarizes it. So we've tried to prepare for a wider range of potential threats and design capabilities for unknown but presumably potent future adversaries. This uncertainty has encouraged the military services to develop weapons systems requirements that are often unmoored from either technological limits or defined enemy capabilities, which is a more long-winded way of saying we've wasted a lot of money trying to build the perfect weapons system. And we have. So how can we rethink that? How can we do procurement and acquisition in a better, more efficient way and build systems, number one, that are actually possible? I think we've sort of fallen in love with the idea that if you can put it on a computer model, what's on that computer model? That's what I want. Well, that's great, but we can't actually do it. And we've spent billions of dollars proving what we should have known in the first place. We really need to rethink that process as we go forward in terms of spending this money. The last area that I think we need to really look at aggressively to save money, and I think this because everybody in the military, certainly everybody who's out of the military now, has told me we have too much middle management. Now, what that means exactly in different places, too many generals, too many admirals, too many layers of acquisition people. I'm told that not only are you paying people, more people than you need, but it actually slows down the process. You have to go through 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different layers of approval, and by the time you do that, you have a much more inefficient system. I think we can look at that and come up with a better tooth-to-tail ratio, if you will. So I think there are places we can look at to actually spend money better. So in conclusion, yes, we have to make the case. Got to have a strong national security. Here's what the cuts would mean. But I think we also have to make the case for how this budget makes sense while protecting the defense budget from further cuts. And I think we also have to be honest about what we can do within the Department of Defense, within our national security budget, to make sure we're getting more for the money that we're actually spending. And I think it is incredibly important that we do this. And I've said this many times, but the way I always like to think about it, we as policymakers decide what the mission is. And then we ask all the young men and women in our military to go out and risk their lives to perform that mission. Whatever we decide the mission is, we have to fund it. It is unacceptable to duck the tough choices up front about reducing the mission, making different choices, and simply say, well, you know what, we don't want to decide which is more preferable, so we're just going to cut everything equally and send it out there and hope that our troops figure out how to make it work. That is the most unacceptable thing that we could do. Let's decide what we can afford, what is in our national security interests, and then fund it so that our troops have the equipment and resources they need to do what we're asking them to do. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions. I will yield to our host, who's supposed to wait for the microphone, by the way.
I follow my own rules, at least thus far. But I'm going to cheat on one of the rules and ask a two-part question. That is 2 questions in one. Very pleased, and I plan to appropriate your pie chart for my personal use, professional use.
Going a little Ross Perot on you there.
Okay,
but,
well, no.
That's the same basic principle.
But it's only a snapshot. It's where we are or where we were in 2010. As you know, as we project the pie into the future, the total mandatory spending, if you include servicing the debt, which is about as mandatory as it gets, that slice of the pie keeps growing. So there's, in some ways, a qualitative difference about addressing the two questions that you posed. I should mention that when we had Mr. McKeon here under duress, he confessed that if it came down to it, he would be in favor of enhanced revenues or some.
So you might imagine I heard about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was a moment of honesty that needs to be enshrined or something like that. But at any rate, so we could, even if we temporarily solved the problem by increasing revenues, we would be back in a similar set of circumstances a couple of years down the road. So what I'm really trying to ask is how you see sort of the balance between putting a rope around entitlements and revenue enhancements that'll put the finances of the federal government on a sound basis going forward to protect the Defense Department and the requirements for defense. Secondly, about the process, it would be interesting. We all look forward to hearing what the administration has to say in its strategic review, but the sequencing is kind of backwards. In other words, we're making financial decisions prior to understanding the effect of them. The department has yet to digest the effects of the Budget Control Act and sort of report back what that will mean. So, couldn't we at least slow things down a little bit so we understand the consequences of making these cuts before we, put the Pentagon on the guillotine through sequestration, or even if, as you say, there's a deal in the super committee that amounts to the same thing. So sorry for the long-winded question. But.
No problem. I'll answer the second part first. Yes, I agree with you. Again, I didn't support the debt ceiling agreement, and that's a large part of why. Even people who are very aggressive, well, that's not true, actually. There are some people who are very aggressive about the deficit who think we should just right now and just forget about it. But most people who are looking at the economy and seeing where it's at, this is a 10-year projection, and I think what we need to do is to put out a 10-year path that puts us on a path to reduce the deficit, not eliminate it. I mean, it's too great to eliminate, and the impact would be too great, but puts us on a path that reassures investors and reassures everybody that we have a plan for not letting this get out of control. So, yes, I think that should come first. And the fact that we got jammed into that deficit reduction issue, debt ceiling issue, was because we were unwilling to confront the first part of your question. And that is revenue and mandatory spending. Bob Kerrey, I remember late 90s, Bob Kerrey was given precisely that speech. He was, he saw the future. He said, this is what the percentage of mandatory spending is going to be, and this is why we have to address it now. We didn't, obviously, but clearly that has to be part of the equation. I think one of the best ways, I can't remember who wrote this, but I was reading an article of someone who was arguing for us to confront this problem, said, look, we have to understand that neither the tax code nor our entitlement law are holy writ, not to be changed or altered in any way. And that's what we get into. As I mentioned in my speech, I'm very fond of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think they perform an important role in their society. Are they perfectly written? Are they written in such a way that you cannot possibly change them in order to save money? Absolutely not. And yes, that has to be part of the equation. Now, I have other charts that I didn't bring here that sort of show how much our revenue has also shrunk. So I think revenue is a little bit more of a fundamental problem than most people are aware. Everyone's aware of the spending issue. But we've cut taxes now pretty consistently for 14 years, to the point where taxes were once 21% of GDP. They're now less than 15%. Part of that is because the economy has not been doing well, but part of it is because we've cut an enormous amount of money from taxes. The capital gains rate is 15%. There's no tax on dividends. Top rate, is all the way down to 35%. I always like to point out that a lot of conservatives say, John Kennedy cut the capital gains rate and it spurred economic growth. Why aren't more Democrats like him? John Kennedy cut the capital gains rate to 50% from 66%. Now, I don't want to go back there. Please don't say that I want to go back there. I will deny it if you quote me. I don't think so. But does it have to be 15? Do we have to have 30? Do we have to have all of the deductions and write-offs that were put into law in the last 10 years? For one thing, we definitely need to simplify the tax code. There's a clear win-win here. You get the more simplified tax code. Now, I'm not a flat tax person. I believe in a progressive tax code. But certainly, we can get rid of a lot of what's in there, simplify it, and make it work. But yeah, it has to be both. And I'm one of, I think we wound up with 90 signatures. There were 45 Democrats, 45 Republicans. The deal was we had to get the same number of each. So I knew there were 45 Democrats. I don't know if we got 45 Republicans. That basically sent a letter to the supercommittee, said, put it all on the table and do something significant. So I'm more than willing to stick my neck out on that. I will make my favorite point on this one, that we need more people who are willing to do that. Back home in my own state, we had the little kerfluffle there over Howard Schultz saying, don't give any money to Congress until they fix this problem. And I thought, if you want people to step up and aggressively confront the deficit, then saying that you're going to step out of the political process only leaves it more to the extremes who don't want them to step up and address this problem. So we need more, not less, active participation from across the country to say, confront this, we will support you, because there's a distinct absence of that right at the moment. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Charter and Freelance Correspondence, Bethesda, Maryland. Congressman Smith, thank you for your service to the nation and coming here. I have three-part of question. First one is this. What's the status of the green aspect and sustainable aspect of military operation, and what's our plan ahead?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. What was that? Could you say that again? I did not understand what you said.
The green and the sustainability aspect of military operation.
The green and sustainability aspect of military operations?
Okay, go ahead.
You understand the green thing?
You're talking about energy issues? Or
Yeah.
Okay, yes, gotcha. Go ahead. Yes.
And also sustainability, because this will affect the spending. And
Absolutely.
Second is this. Is there a way doing, or how do you change the mentality of the Cold War? Because this will affect spending too. And the third is this, what's the cooperation between China and U.S. On sea and security? Thank you.
I think that those are great questions. The last two I'll put together, and this is something I feel very strongly about. The world has changed. The U.S. was first in a bipolar world with the Soviet Union, and then we were the sole remaining superpower, as the cliche went back in the 1990s. Well, the rest of the world's catching up. It's not just China. China, India, Brazil, the European Union's still a factor. There's a lot of different power centers in the world, and my belief is that the U.S. should embrace that, find ways to cooperate with the rest of the world so that we all have a greater stake in global security, so that it's not just all on our shoulders in the U.S. To provide security for the world, number one, and also so that we don't stumble our way into a Cold War with China. Now, there are a lot of things about China that I don't agree with, a different way of doing things that that are contrary to the values that I have and that the United States has. But they are in no way, shape, manner, or form the same as the Soviet Union was. I mean, that was a clear competition for the direction of the world. We are not there with China, and if we stumble into being there with China, we're going to be in a very bad place. So I think we should look for ways to cooperate with them. I mean, China is new to being a global power, and they don't always handle it well. But they are a global power. Their economy is rising. They're spending more money on the military. And we can either be in a death grip competition with them, or we can figure out some way to bring them into the global order. Because they got a stake in making sure that those supply lines don't get disrupted as well. They need a free-flowing, functioning global economy. They are, after all, capitalists from an economic standpoint. So I think we should clearly look for those opportunities and avoid stumbling into a Cold War mentality. Now, that's a lot easier to say than it is to do, but I believe that should be our principle. And we've got to be real careful about, using belligerent language and trying to, think of China as an enemy and turn it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't think that's in our best interests. On the energy question, No one consumes more energy in the United States than the Department of Defense, and they're working aggressively to find ways to do less of that and to do it in a more cost-efficient manner. I think this is another way that DoD spending impacts the rest of the economy. There are a ton of programs going on in DoD right now that are increasing energy efficiency and developing alternative energy, working in particular on how to use waste disposal from landfills and turn it into energy. It's really Back to the Future actually playing out. Not quite. You can't just dump it into nuclear power accelerator there. But it is actually, one of Joint Base Lewis McChord is one of a dozen or so bases that's got the net zero goal, and their net zero goal is to have net zero land waste by 2020. And part of that is figuring out how to convert a good chunk of that into energy. So I think there are real opportunities there as well. Yes, sir.
Sir, thank you. George Nicholson from Stratcorp. You mentioned the emerging strategy. The large session that CSIS had last June, there was a panel chaired by John Hamre with the former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Fogelman, Davis Chu, and Sean O'Keefe. And one of the points they brought up, in the past where we've had these drawdowns, there's been a floor. You could talk about, well, we've got global war with the Soviets and the three. When that went away, we had the bottom-up review, we had the base case. They said that's not there anymore. They said our only hope right now is the strategic review will be in place by the 1st of October. I think you alluded to it at your presentation at CSIS, but without that, how difficult is it for you or your colleagues to go back to the districts and say, trust me, we need this for defense, if you can't articulate what the threat is out there or what the risks are going to take by reducing the force structure?
No, I think it's very difficult in two ways. One is the point you make, and that's what I was trying to say earlier, that we need to get beyond just the the charts and the graphs and the pictures of here's how much smaller it's going to be, here's how many fewer troops we're going to have it, and actually translate it into a strategy. So I think we need to do a better job of that, and it was easier, as I said, with the Soviet Union out there. Well, they got this many nuclear missiles. If we don't counter them, we're in big trouble. Everybody got that, and I think we definitely need to do a better job of that. And the second part of the problem is it's such an uncertain world. Secretary Gates always liked to say that, I won't give you the long-winded quote, basically we're always wrong about what threats we're going to have to confront. And that's kind of a scary thing to say, because then it's sort of like license for absolutely every policy person and every think tank person to say, yeah, here's the ones we should be. It scatters us all over the map. We really need leadership from the Armed Services Committees, from the President, from the Secretary of Defense to say, here's our strategy, here's where I think we should go. And I sort of outlined in my speech where I think it should go. Al-Qaeda, number one, that I think is the greatest threat. Number two, being present in Asia and the Middle East. Okay, well, what are the forces that are necessary to make that happen? And where can we save money? But the sooner we begin to get that clear articulation, I think everyone's worried about doing it, because I'm sure my staff is like, I wish he hadn't said that. Because people are going to say, well, what about this? How come you're not thinking about that? How come you're not thinking about the other thing? Now you've totally ignored this. Once you put a strategy out there, they just start shooting at you. But we've got to show leadership on this to put that strategy out there. And I would say one of the ways to avoid a little bit of that, backlash is be flexible, because that has to be part of the strategy. I think the Guard and Reserve is going to be incredibly important. We're going to need a surge capacity because we don't know for sure what's happening. So you can look at different ways to fuse into that strategy the uncertainty, increase your flexibility in a cost-effective way. But you're right. The time is now. We have got to begin to deliver that message, or it's going to be harder and harder to convince people that we need it.
Mark Moore, Senator Chambliss's office. At yesterday's hearing, the idea was put forward to ask the military to move up some of their maintenance and replacement schedules as a way of protecting and stimulating the contractor base. Could you just comment on that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, it's, to a certain degree, what we did with the idea of doing 2 submarines a year of the Virginia class to get ready for that. You consolidate, get more cost effective. Certainly, we're saving an enormous amount of money. I think we should look for opportunities to do that. I think that should be part of the strategy. I'd have to go through sort of weapon system by weapon system to see where it makes sense. And then also you do have the short-term problem of that. Do you have the money in the short term to do that. And you also have to, again, embrace the notion that, occasionally government spending in the short term is a positive thing. But I think clearly that should be a big part of the strategy. Look at our weapon systems and say, if we can move them up, build them quicker, build them more efficiently, is that going to save us money in the long term? I think that's a critical piece to be looking at in the strategic review that we've described. So, yes.
Hi, Andrew Basevich has said that only 2 criteria should be used to determine whether or not troops should be stationed in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And he said, is their presence needed, and does it demonstrably contribute to stability and security in the region? So I'd ask you, using those 2 questions, how would you evaluate the future presence of troops in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia? Thanks.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to go piece by piece because I haven't examined this question in great detail. It's worth pointing out that Andrew Basevich also wrote a very lengthy article in The Atlantic explaining why power projection was essentially a waste of money. And I disagree with him on that point. I think certainly there have been instances where we've projected power in ways that haven't been helpful, but our ability to be global has had countless positive outcomes. 1996, I think it was, when China started, kvetching about Taiwan because Taiwan was talking about independence. We sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the straits there, and boom, end of problem. Our ability to be there stopped that. If we didn't have the ability to project power, for instance, we wouldn't have a problem with North Korea right now. We'd have a problem with Korea. We were able to project our forces, to respond after 9/11 in Afghanistan. So I think there is a value there. I think you also have to understand that if we have forces in Europe, for instance, even if you're not, worried about a security problem in Europe, though I will point out that the Balkans are still, somewhat unsettled, having them there puts them closer to a number of different places in the Middle East and Asia where they can be more quickly and more efficiently deployed. It also helps build our relationship with our NATO allies. Yes, I know our NATO allies have very, relatively speaking, weak defense budgets, and they're going in the wrong direction on that, but they are nonetheless part of the equation, and maintaining that relationship is important. And our military presence is one powerful way to maintain positive relationships, frankly, even if there isn't an immediate security need. As I pointed out, those 700 port visits that we've done in Asia, has helped cement relationships. I mean, it's an economic boon to the area when we come in. We do a lot of medical care in some places. And also the last thing about force protection, that folks on the left should remember, we were the primary force that showed up when the tsunami hit Indonesia, when the tsunami hit Japan, when the earthquakes hit Pakistan. So our ability to project power isn't just in a military way. It also spreads our influence by helping people when they need help the most. If we didn't have the logistical ability of the United States military, the Haiti earthquake would have been even worse than it was. So all of those things factor into it. Now, we still got the budget that we've got. So we're going to have to start making some choices there. All power projection is not equal. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go country by country and say, we can forget about that country, because I think we need to do the analysis a little more thoughtfully than that. But that's got to be part of the equation in figuring out how we save money in an effective way. Is there a cheaper way to project all of that power that I just talked about? I think we're going to need to examine that question. Yes, I'm sorry. We'll go right there. I got 3 more here. There, and then these 2.
My name is Bill Ludi. I spent many years at a naval air station up the road from your district on Whidbey Island, so thank you for being with us today.
Beautiful place.
It is. I have a 2-part question to sort of keep in the tradition of the questioning this morning.
You just tested.
Yeah, that's right. The first one is a little lighthearted. 250 years ago, there was a famous economic philosopher who wrote that the first duty of the sovereign is to protect the nation from invasion. And the only way to do that is through a military force. And your views on military strategy and requirements are quite impressive and reminiscent of that great thinker. Are you in any way directly related to Adam Smith?
I'm loosely, my roots are Scotch English,
well,
so it's possible.
You should claim it because it's quite a remarkable resemblance. The second part of my question is more straightforward. In the post-World War II period, we continually go through this sinusoidal approach, this up and down, this peak and valley approach to defense spending. And it seems to me that the cost of maintaining defense spending, say at a nominal 4% of GDP, instead of bringing it back down again, and the cost of rebuilding in a crisis far outweighs the cost of maintaining it at a certain level. Is there any way, or is it a pipe dream, to set defense spending at a certain level on a bipartisan basis so we don't go through this, decade after decade?
We can do better than we've done, but no, I don't think we can simply set it at a given level. And what you say applies to the whole rest of the budget too. The more consistency we have in funding, and that's why I say the best thing that we can do, for the economy, for our budget, is to come up with that 10-year plan. To say, here's how we're going to reform the tax code. Here's how we're going to reform entitlements. Here's our 10-year projections for spending. It's going to get the deficit under control, and it's going to be reasonable. If we could do that, that would be the single best thing we could do for the economy and also for defense. There's always going to be ebb and flow. I mean, we're not going to have the exact same defense needs from one year to the next, from one decade to the next. So I think you underestimate a little bit the downside of, certainly if we don't have enough, you got to scramble to catch up. But if you also build a whole lot of stuff that you don't need or have an enormous force that you don't need, there's a cost to that as well. It's part of the challenge of budgeting in an uncertain world. But clearly, we can do better than we've done right now. There were a couple questions up here, and then that gentleman over there next.
Hi, Megan Scully with CQ. You mentioned, obviously, the strategy, the ongoing strategy review and the need for leadership, both in Congress and the administration. But there are certainly constituencies, both in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill, who, back certain missions which involve weapon systems and whatnot. How do you get beyond that? And can you look to anything in any time in the past where that was successful? And do you think it's possible now?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we've, a lot of weapon systems have been canceled, when there was incredible political pressure. When I first got here, there was a big fight over whether or not to build a whole bunch more B-2s. And believe me, there was a lot of pressure to do it. We didn't do it. So there have been countless examples of when, Congress and the President have stood up to industry interests and constituencies and said that's just not the right thing to do. And how do you do that? It's really rather simple. You simply be ethical and you focus on policy. It's no more complicated than that. Now it gets difficult in some instances to try to balance out what is the right policy. Do we really need this piece of equipment? Do we really need that one? But I think it is underestimated the degree to which members of Congress and our staff get to the right answer. That we don't just accept, okay, well, this is a big company in my district, they want this, so therefore what they want is what we give them. It really doesn't work that way. And believe me, the industry lobbyists can tell you that. They can complain bitterly about how they didn't get what they wanted in 1,000 different examples. When it comes to national security defense policy, our staff in the House and the Senate is outstanding. And they explain to us what the trade-offs and what the choices are. And if it's not the right thing to do, we don't do it. Far more than most people give us credit for. Yes.
Martin Matashak with Global Security Newswire. There's a debate brewing in the House right now over whether NNSA funding and nuclear weapons funding writ large should be looked at by the Super Committee for reductions or savings. I know Congressman Markey has a plan that he's putting forward to save billions over 10 years. Congressman Turner is firmly against it. Do you think those funds should be on the table, should be examined for reductions or for savings?
They certainly, since I have said throughout this, everything has to be on the table. I'm not going to take anything off the table, and I think we can have that conversation. I do think that we've made rather significant reductions in our nuclear force, and I would be reluctant to go further. And a lot of folks don't understand just how complicated it is to maintain that nuclear arsenal. I've visited a number of our labs, trying to figure out how you keep a weapon that's, 10, 20, 30, 40 years old, still operational and functional. There's a lot of money that goes into that. I think the president negotiated a pretty aggressive deal on the START treaty. Now, once we get that done, can we look at it again and figure out what our needs are? Sure, but right now, I think that START treaty reflects pretty closely what our needs are. And I know a big part of Congressman Markey's plan is to reduce the number of next generation SSBN submarines, and I don't agree with that. I mean, that is the strongest part of the triad that we have. We've got a debate about how many tubes it needs to have, and we could probably live with the smaller number of tubes, though I haven't clearly decided that yet. But I think having that part of the triad is important. So I would not look at that as a place where we could find an enormous amount of savings, no. Anybody else? One last one. Go ahead.
Probably one you don't want, sir.
That's it. I love tough questions.
Thank you very much. It is probably one you don't want to answer, but it is not meant on a political basis at all. But looking at all the costs and looking at the things that you graciously laid out today and said, yes, everything's on the table. Issue the draft. Is it coming back?
The draft is not coming back, absent some horrific national security threat, because roughly 80% of the people don't support it. There is no political will whatsoever for the draft. Now, the specter that has been raised is if we don't have an adequate enough defense budget, we won't be able to provide the retirement, the health care, the benefits that we've had before, and we won't be able to get the volunteer force that we need. I think to say that is speculative is an incredible underestimation. I suspect that as we're doing our strategic review, no matter what happens to the budget, we will make sure that the strategy matches the force that we can recruit. And we won't get rid of things that stop us from being able to recruit the forces that we need to recruit. I believe very strongly that the all-volunteer force has worked and worked quite well. We have an incredibly capable military. And I also think while there's a point that's made 1% of the country is involved in the military, 99% isn't paying attention to it. I think sometimes that is overstated. Now partially, I'm in a different world. I represent Joint Base Lewis McChord. The military is a part of our community. But I can tell you there is a heck of a lot of support, even throughout, shouldn't have said that. But the blue state of Washington is very supportive of our military. And they understand how important it is. And I think we can all, frankly, be very proud of how we've responded to our troops coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq. There's been a lot of support from endless groups, and I think it is working. Now, there's a lot more that we need to do, particularly on PTSD, but there is a willingness to do it. Our problem on PTSD right now is there's like 45 different programs. Nobody knows which one works better, and we're not coordinating the resources better. But I believe the all-volunteer force works, and it will continue to work, and I cannot envision a situation where we bring back the draft. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming. This whole bipartisanship probably has more going for it than we remember. We may not make, Hannity or Chris Matthews this evening, but it gives me a certain warm tingle that I'd like to repeat. Anybody named Adam Smith has a home at AEI. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.